Hello there, welcome to my second video on the Catalan. Today we're gonna look at the line of the d takes c4, bishop g2, a6. In the first video we looked at b5 and thereafter a4, black had to react with c6, and there's a good argument in favor of a6 that it's nicer to be able to put the structure a6, b5 and try to get onto the long diagonal immediately with bishop d7. And it's also a very principled approach for black because, again, he's trying to hold onto this pawn that he just captured on c4. So, white castles. As I said in the Catalan, we are not that much concerned about this pawn, but we want to develop and put our pieces on the right squares, and then from a position of strength we will show that this pawn doesn't really count for much. And on the other hand, of course, black is still losing more time to protect precisely this pawn. So black goes b5, exposing the long diagonal again. And of course the natural reaction is knight d5. And here the main line for black is knight d5, but we should stop for a second because there is quite a nice idea for black to actually play c6. First of all, the point is we would like not to go knight d5 where we're going to be kicked from by means of e2, e4 with tempo. And the second point is, after the seemingly forced knight c6, black goes queen b6, and now the knight has to go somewhere. If he goes knight e5, black actually opposes on the long diagonal successfully and will manage to complete his development. Actually, as a general rule of thumb in the Catalan, if black gets his queenside in order, basically develops his queenside and neutralizes the strong bishop on g2 without making any major concession, then he probably solved the biggest part of his opening problems. And if white takes on b8, rook b8, same is going to happen. Black will play bishop b7, then develop the bishop from f8 and successfully finish all his development. So c6 turns out to be quite a cunning idea, and the refutation is very instructive. White goes b3, and after cb3, here comes the point. Knight takes c6, queen b6, and we manage to remove the knight with tempo by playing knight a5. And if black goes rook a7, then we take on b3, and we've managed not to help black with his development. Actually, now he's placed kind of awkwardly with his queen on b6, rook a7, and the knight is still on b8. And at some point there might be ideas with d5 and bishop e3 making use of this awkward placement of pieces. So, this is a nice trick to remember, that b3 basically takes out the sting of this whole idea. And now let's go back to the main line. Black goes knight d5. And now white has to attack this queenside structure of black, going a4, which forces bishop b7, ab. We take on a8. And at first sight this looks like we just exchanged a rook, spent a tempo on this, on opening the file to be able to do this operation. So what have we actually gotten for this? But it will become clear in a moment. So finally white is kicking the knight from d5, and knight f6 is always forced because if the knight goes away any further from the king's side, let's go on knight b6, then queen h5 is basically crushing. You cannot even play g6 because after this sequence, the rook on h8 is gonna be lost, since rook g8, queen e6 doesn't help. Now the rook is picked up anyways. So the knight needs to go back to the king's side, to the natural square f6. We see that after we have undermined the queen side a little with a4, a6, now this pawn is again exposed on b5. And now finally black has to make the move that he was trying to avoid by starting with a6. He has to go c6 to defend on b5. Because if he goes b4, there is a very powerful queen a4 check. And we also see another slight benefit of exchanging rooks on a8. The bishop is somewhat misplaced on a8 where it's hanging right now. And after c6, it also becomes clear that the bishop is really worse on a8 than on b7, because now it's quite hard to get back into the game. Black needs to lose one tempo just to play bishop b7, where it's still kind of sad and just has a little more prospects like a6, c8. So now we have kind of reached the the main position of this line, and where it's very important to understand the strategic nature of the struggle. Because white has nicely developed his pieces, taking possession of the center, but black is held onto his extra pawn, and all he wants to do now is to finish development and then be a healthy pawn up. So, as usual with the lead in development, we have to open up the position. Now b3 doesn't really help with anything because of the b3 taking, there's no threat at all, and black will just carry on with development. So instead we use our other tool to open the position, and that is d5. And here black faces imminent problems, because if he doesn't take on d5, but let's say goes for bishop e7, white will go d takes e6, f7 is hanging with check, so there's no time for queen takes d1, and after fe, white of course keeps the queens, castles, and now starts immediately to pinpoint the weakness on e6. And we immediately see that the king is not so happy with what's left from the kingside structure. So to defend the pawn on e6, it would be nice to have a bishop on b7 that could go bishop c8 now. Instead, black has to use his queen for the job. And now white just continues development, takes the open file, and is soon ready to increase the pressure with ideas like knight f3, knight g5, then e5 will be in the air as well. And overall, it's quite a miserable position for black. So let's go back to the position after d5. Black can try other moves, like bishop d6. And all these lines, they illustrate pretty well that it's really hard to shake off this superior development of white's. White just goes bishop f4. And again threatening to take on e6 or c6, so going cd5. Now there's an extra option of playing knight b5, because the threat of taking on d6 followed by something like knight f7 is of course crushing. So black takes on e5. Castles. Looks good for now, but white can use his superior development and pose immediate problems by going bishop d6, which will pick up some material. Here the exchange, because rook e8 would be met by e5 and then knight c7. It's again showing that the bishop is miserable on a8 and picking up some material with the fork. So it's really hard for black to do anything but to take on d5, but that will open up the position further. But let's look at the line. cd5, of course ed5 is forced, and now black has a choice. Let's start with e takes d5. And what I like to do is to do a count of the material. Now black is up 2 pawns, but let's look at the rest of the material. Okay, there is a good knight on f6 which is developed, there is a bishop on a8, which at least supports the center, but all the rest of black's position is completely undeveloped, while all of white's pieces are either already doing something or about to enter the game, like rook e1, bishop g5 are in the air all the time. So we could say, right now white is playing with 2, 3, 4 pieces more, depending on what happens on every next move. And given the open nature of the position, that should lead to decisive results. And of course, in general, we don't like to exchange pieces if we are the attacker. But here's a very curious moment, because this knight on f6 is like the main defender of the black position. And if you imagine like some kind of sports game, like soccer or basketball or ice hockey, and we are 5 against 4 or 11 against 10, the team with 1 player less can still fight on and pretty much be successful. But when it becomes like 2 against 1 or 1 against 0 for argument's sake, then of course it's impossible to defend in any situation. And this is why here it's a really good idea to go knight g4 and take out basically the only real defender of the black position. So black can try to keep the position somewhat close with knight e4. And now we have a nice development move, bishop f4, which is coming up with the threat, because knight e4, queen d8 would lead to winning the knight on b8. So black has to lose time and exchange his developed piece on c3, because the otherwise natural move, bishop d6, runs into a direct attack, queen d4, and bishop h6, and g8 would lead to quite a nice mate. And this is possible because the, as I said before, natural defender of the black kingside, the knight on f6, had to depart from that square. So let's go back a few moves. And if black wouldn't go knight e4, then white is simply gonna take on f6, play rook e1, check knight d5, and black is just completely collapsing. So instead of e d5, let's look at bishop d5. And here comes a quite interesting moment as well, because the bishop on g2 is like the pride of the Catalan player, and the first instinct would be to take with the knight on d5. But actually there is nothing left of the black queen side, and we will see in a couple of moves that it will be much nicer to have the knight who can land on d5 than the bishop on g2 that will eventually be looking at an empty queen side, since now we are playing for an attack on the black king. So white goes bishop d5, and black has to go e d5 because of the knight d5. Again, we exploit that the black king side is without defense, queen h5. Now there are two moves. One is queen f6, which is met by knight d5, e d5, rook on the open file, bishop e7. And now, of course, is the moment to crash through, because we don't want to let black castle. So the last piece comes into the game with decisive effect, bishop g5. After queen g5, white is just taking off all of black's queen side and will quickly mate the naked black king. And if black tries to be sneaky with queen f5, using that there is a pin on the bishop, then there's a really nice way to finish the game. Using that the e-file is open, knight g6. And after queen g6, rook e7, we are just penetrating to e8, or after f6, rook c7, and that's the end of the game. So knight d5 is not an option. By the way, I should also mention g6, but this motif is somewhat common in all these lines. We take on g6, queen e5, and there's a huge problem with the rook on h8, since rook g8 loses the rook anyways to queen e6, and the only way for black to keep on playing is knight f6, and he's still losing a piece and plays on with open king and inferior development and somewhat weak pawns on the queen side. So instead of knight d5, let's look at e d5. And now you already know how to conduct the attack. We try to take out the main defender, we go knight g4. And also knight e4 is kind of a feeble attempt to fend off the white attack and try to somehow close the e-file, but we just take on d5, and when all your pieces are active, you have a really nice reaction to every artificial attempt to stop you. For example, after f5, knight h6 is super strong. Gh is just met by queen h5, and you pick up all the material you want. And if this knight is not taken, then let's say queen d7, then white just increases the pressure with rook e1, and still gh is not possible on account of knight f6. So knight e4 is not really an option, but after bishop e7, it's nice to see how white will finish off this attack in style. So we take on f6. Now, of course, you give a check, and black simply doesn't have time for bishop e7 because this pin will be deadly. So he has to go king f8 instead. We take on d5, and now we basically play the rest of the game with an extra rook and a very strong knight on d5. So this pawn we are down, it doesn't count, it's more like we are rook up in this game. Knight c6, black can't do anything but to develop. Bishop e3, white does the same. h5 is logical, otherwise there's no chance to get this rook into the game. But now with all white's pieces in the game, it's time to look for a decisive way to finish it off. So we look at the forced moves, bishop c5, king g8. And now maybe try to take a moment, maybe stop the video even, and try to see if you find the finishing touch. And something I have seen many times in my chess career, the strong side breaks through on what seems to be the strongest spot in the defender's camp, and e7 is like defended a couple of times, but bishop e7 is just completely crushing black's coordination. After knight e7, white wins the queen, and it's no different after bishop e7, knight e7. Also black can set himself up for quite a nice mate. Instead in the game, black played queen c8. It's a game Elyanov, Ukrainian super grandmaster, against another grandmaster, Igor Novikov from Russia. And that game finished with bishop f6, gf, knight f6. Also, white could have played rook e8, of course, winning the queen. But here he simply could choose which way he wanted to win. So knight f6, taking another pawn. And the game finished quite elegantly. and this way, and there is no way to, well, obviously black is getting mated. So once again we saw that it's very, very dangerous for black to decide sticking to the pawn he took on c4, because he has to invest more time, and at the same time to make contact with this pawn on c4 by playing b5, he's exposing the long diagonal and inviting white just to activate his pieces with tempo and develop harmonious pressure on the black position. So this is it for video 2 of my series on the Catalan.